Welcome, everybody. And today our topic is civic entrepreneurship, the art and science of innovative public policy making. And I wanted to start off by sharing a common sentiment. People like to complain about government, and they typically say government costs too much, takes too long, and accomplishes too little. So what can we do about it? I propose that we get entrepreneurial about fixing the pipes of government. And what do I mean by pipes of government? I mean the systems that we use to turn funding and policy into deliverables and outcomes for the American people. And what do we mean by entrepreneurial? I'm introducing this concept of civic entrepreneurship as one that combines two American traditions: the spirit of innovation, the spirit that we can do anything if we put our minds to it, and the spirit of community, that we are here to be of service to each other for the public good. And when I think about a civic entrepreneur, these are public sector leaders who are collaboratively delivering innovative policies to improve outcomes for communities. Thank you, Hannah. And I wanted to share one of my favorite civic entrepreneurs as an example. You may be familiar with Frances Perkins, and if you are not, I'm very excited to introduce you to her. She was the first female secretary that we have had in our federal government. She was a Secretary of Labor under President FDR from 1933 to 1945. And we can thank Frances Perkins for being incredibly entrepreneurial and introducing legislation that has had profound positive benefits for our society for decades. She created Social Security, unemployment insurance, the federal minimum wage, and it's thanks to Frances Perkins that we also have federal laws regarding child labor. And something to keep in mind is that at her time, these were policies that were very creative. They were very groundbreaking. And today, these are things that we consider to be just standard. And so that is the role that civic entrepreneurs play in our federal government and really at all levels of government. And so our goal for today is to inspire you to adopt civic entrepreneurship behaviors in your role, either as a government or civic sector leader, or even as a concerned citizen. A little bit about me. My name is Shannon Arvizu. I am a sociologist. I've also worked in the private sector for quite a few years as an agile enterprise consultant. And in the last few years, returned to the public sector as a civic entrepreneur. And I was inspired during the pandemic to get more involved in the public sector again, primarily because I became fascinated with the idea that every day Americans were guiding their behaviors based on data sourced in these dashboards. We're locked inside, we're just hyper-focused on what are the trends, what does it look like today in my community? Is it safe to go out? Is it safe to go out without a mask? How should I think about how I want to live my life based on data? And it got me thinking, we're looking at data regulated society, pretty cool, but what could be cooler is if we also considered where is all of the other data that tells us about how our society is doing. And if we were able to have a place to govern our communities in a way that enabled us to see, are we headed in the right direction? Does the data let us know that we need to course correct, and by how much? That could be a huge win to informing how we think about public policy. And so my role within the government currently is as what I call a bridge builder for data capacity. And so I'm working as a public service fellow in the Tech and Society group at Georgetown McCourt School for Public Policy. I'm also serving as a senior advisor to the chief data officer in the Commerce Department. And in this role, I get to work as a bridge builder for Fed, state, and local tech and data capacity. I'll share a little bit more about my role. My current portfolio as a senior advisor within the Department of Commerce, you may or may not know that Department of Commerce is known as America's data agency. We are home to the US Census, NOAA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and 10 other bureaus, and there are more than $1 trillion in federal funds that are distributed to states and localities using DOC data. And so my portfolio over the last couple of years has been, how do we strengthen the implementation of American Rescue Plan Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS, and the Inflation Reduction Act with innovative data practices? And some of the work that I've had the opportunity to do today includes leading work streams within Department of Commerce to improve our program data efforts for those programs. We had a chance to publish a guide that is all about innovation and evidence building on how to evolve your program data management practices in order to do more equitable implementation. I'm also working on our FY25-28 data strategy, and I lead an interagency community practice on equitable data with 700 plus federal data practitioners. This is a very entrepreneurial time to be working within the federal government, and I am so honored that I get to do the work that I do, and I am infused with enthusiasm and optimism and the can-do spirit, and surrounded by people that are really committed to evolve our government institutions for better implementation. One of the other things that we've had the opportunity to do is to stand up the U.S. Policy Network, which is a way to enable state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to build durable tech and data capacity with federal funding and coordinated efforts. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about the civic entrepreneurship work I've been doing within the federal government. And I want to talk about our main event today, our agenda. And so I'm first going to share the 10 leadership behaviors of civic entrepreneurship as I've seen them within my role. And then the second part, I want to share some strategies for success. So I'm going to introduce a framework that I call the SNAP framework that I developed in my research around how successful policy movements occur and maybe don't occur sometimes, and how you might apply that to your work. And then the third thing I'd like to share today is, what does civic entrepreneurship look like for successful policy implementation across Fed, state, and local government, especially in an increasingly complex world? There is more and more need for us to think about coordinated efforts across the policy domains. And so I'm going to share an example of what that looks like in action from the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So with that, we're going to get into it. And as Hannah mentioned, if you have any thoughts or questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get a chance to answer them after the presentation. So let's talk about, what are the top 10 leadership behaviors of civic entrepreneurship? And I think about civic entrepreneurship as both art and science. So what do I mean by that? I mean, on the art side, there is an attention to the people that we work with, the relationships, the social system by which we communicate, the level of psychological safety and trust, the desire for change, the motivation to do things that are maybe outside of our normal job description. And then there's also the process side. So what are the things that we can do to break down silos, to introduce new ways of working, to figure out what are the most efficient ways that we can implement the mission that we've been given to deliver for the American people? And so one of those components is a focus on the public good. So a common denominator of civic entrepreneurs is that we have a desire to work towards the common good, support the well-being of people and communities. And the public good is encompassing of working within governmental entities. Maybe you work within civil society, maybe you work within social entrepreneurship world, that there's an opportunity to work within, across, or even outside governmental entities. But what unites us is a focus on the public good. The second thing that civic entrepreneurs embody is this ability to creatively combine resources. Oftentimes, there are not set budgets for doing this work. And so what we do is we think about, what are the intellectual resources that we have? What are political resources, the organizational resources that we can combine into new policies, programs, and courses of action? The third thing is that we are gritty. We are persistent in our efforts. We don't take no for an answer. And we recognize that obstacles are a part of the work of change. and that we know that these things take time. We're patient, and we know that it's an endurance. It's an endurance game. It's a marathon. Change, evolution in our government structures is an endurance game, and we are up for the challenge. Fourth, we know the power of stories. And so when we think about challenges and when we think about proposed solutions, we think about who are we talking with and what are the things that resonate with our stakeholders, and how do we frame these challenges and solutions in a way that also connects deeply with our stakeholders. We also have a wide lens towards policy. And so this is not just, congressional law. When we think about policy, yes, it includes laws, yes, it includes regulations, but policy also comes in the form of program design, procedures and how we work together, administrative actions, incentives, could be management practices or other approaches. We also think about what does it mean to apply entrepreneurship across the policy cycle? So from the very inception of what the problem is to thinking about what data is needed to inform what the solution should be, to consulting with our stakeholders, to what can we do to be entrepreneurial about how policies are adopted and implemented, or even how they're monitored and evaluated. We also think about how do we build bridges. You've seen this graphic here at the beginning. I've been using this term bridge builder. Great book recently out of HBR that talks about the importance of collaborating with stakeholders across sectors and disciplines to solve challenges. We are also in the business of cultivating collective intelligence. We are asked to lead working groups of senior leaders across many different agencies, many of whom have not really had the opportunity to speak about this topic or to work on this challenge together until the moments when we bring them together. So how do we facilitate a shared reality of this situation that we're trying to address? And how do we help these folks diverge, consider all the different options, and converge, select the option that makes the most sense, that's the most feasible to act on, that's going to have the most impact given the circumstances that we're in? So it's not necessarily about civic entrepreneurs bringing their ideas, their babies, if you will, to say, hey, do you like my baby? It's more of let's bring folks together to understand what are the things that we all see as the problem and what are the things that we all see as the most promising solution moving forward. And then we think about how might we implement change in an agile way. So yes, we do work in an environment where we often are in a situation where we have a set amount of funding and it needs to be spent in a certain way and at a certain cadence. That said, there are still many opportunities for thinking about what are the feedback loops with the people that we're delivering with to ensure that every stage of the journey, we're continuously improving what it is that we are doing. And then we think about how do we strategically prepare for those policy windows. There are moments in time when change is more or less successful. And we recognize that oftentimes we may be working during a situation where that policy window is closed. But it doesn't mean that we stop working on the thing that we think is going to be the most innovative. It means that we lay the foundation for when that window opens up again. And then lastly, we inspire champions to scale change. Civic entrepreneurs know that we don't work alone, that change is a team sport, and that change often happens in stages. And so I have this graphic here of the innovation distribution curve, which is often used in the tech world to explain how technology gets adopted. And I think in many ways, we can think about this in terms of how policy gets adopted. In the very beginning, we have a small group of innovators who say, yay, shiny new thing. And then we have the early adopters who say, cool kids have a new tool I want. And then there tends to be this chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. And in order to cross that chasm, it's really important to know who your early adopters are of that policy, who have demonstrated that that policy is actually worth implementing, that we can use as exemplars to model moving forward. So I will pause here to have you all reflect, where are you seeing examples of civic entrepreneurship in your government teams? And I've divided these behaviors between more of the art of civic entrepreneurship and the science of civic entrepreneurship. And so as we start to dive into this a little bit deeper, it's important to recognize that there are pockets of civic entrepreneurship within your institutions. And in order to bring those pockets more to life, it's important to recognize them. I think that there's a lot that we can do, a lot that we can learn from the field of positive psychology, strengths-based psychology, which is all about the idea that if we want more positive change to happen, you're going to get there by affirming what's already working well than by dwelling on what's not working well. So we have this now to consider as you are exploring bringing more civic entrepreneurship into your team as just some foundational concepts to think about. So now I'm going to move to part 2, which is all about how can we start to think about being strategic about when and where to be entrepreneurial for the policies that we'd like to implement. And I like to look at successful policy movements of the past in order to think about what might successful policy movements of the future look like. And so I'm going to introduce a framework that I developed in my research. I call policy movements are a snap, which is a little counterintuitive because you think, oh, if something is a snap, that means it's very simple and easy. I'm not saying that they're simple and easy, but we do know that there are conditions that make policy movements more or less likely successful. And here are those conditions. The first S, it's an acronym. I work in government, so of course we need acronyms. The first letter, S, stands for story. So we need to frame our policy solution in a way that explains the problem and the solution in a way that resonates with the largest amount of people that we believe that we need to connect with and that need to be stakeholders and invested in what we're doing. And so I use the Montgomery bus boycott as an example of what this framework looks like in action. And so you may be familiar with this story. It's a story of Rosa Parks. And the story is, one day, this seamstress was working hard all day, and it was time for her to go home, and she boarded the bus, and all the seats in the back of the bus were taken. And she was just too darn tired to care anymore about the segregation policies on the bus. And she sat down in the front of the bus. And this is a story that can resonate with anyone. You don't have to be Rosa Parks. You don't have to be Black. You don't have to be a seamstress. You could be young, you could be old, you could be rich, you could be poor. Everyone can resonate with the idea of being too darn tired to just care about an existing structure that is just doesn't make sense for you in the moment. And so the S stands for story. This was a story that mobilized multiple sectors of society to get behind the desegregation of buses during this time. So the N stands for network, the network of organizations that get behind that story. And it's important to recognize that, especially if you're thinking about large-scale policy change, that it will take multiple organizations and multiple sectors to enact that large-scale policy change. But even within your department or your team, thinking about who are those network of people, who are those networks of departments that can get behind this policy initiative. So if we go back to our Montgomery bus boycott example, the network of organizations that got behind that story included churches, colleges, businesses. And the A stands for action. So all of those networks were organized around a specific action at a specific time that was intended to take advantage of the tenuous nature of the political opportunity structure, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But they chose this action, which is to boycott the buses intentionally, because at the time, African-American bus riders made up 50% of the revenue for the local bus line. And so by boycotting the buses, they were not only able to make a symbolic gesture, a symbolic hit, but they were also able to make a very strong economic hit. And so they walked. And they also organized the world's first rideshare service. So those of the community that had cars, they then offered them up to take people to where they needed to go, because they still needed to go from point A to point B to get to work, to get to school. And they walked for a year. They were very persistent. They were very gritty. And at the time, one of the most powerful ways to support the movement was to donate shoes to the community. So Black churches, and we're all over the country, we're sending shoes to the Montgomery community so that way they could continue walking. And then the last element of the P stands for political opportunity. So they could have organized this bus boycott a couple years before 1955, but they may not have been as successful as waiting until after the schools were desegregated, which happened in 1954. So that provided a window of opportunity that indicated there is a moment for change. There is a window opening up that we may be able to take advantage of if we have the right story, the right network of organizations, the right targeted action. So policy movements are a snap. I have another example that is, again, from my own research, it's a little bit more recent, and that is the electric vehicle industry. And so when I was doing my dissertation, I watched a documentary, maybe some of you watched it. It's called Who Killed the Electric Car? It's a fascinating documentary of what happened in California in the early 2000s when the California Air Resources Board made a policy after they had seen demonstrations of cars that were able to drive that were able to be driven for reasonable distances without using any gas. They could be plugged in. And so they developed a policy, called it the Zero Emission Vehicle Policy. And they had said to automakers that if you want to sell cars in California, a certain percentage of the cars need to be zero emission vehicles by a certain time period. And the automakers resisted. There was a large effort to weaken the policies and to eventually dismantle that policy. And so this documentary tracks that journey. And if you fast forward to 2010, every major automaker had announced plans to produce and mass market at least one EV model nationwide. So what changed? Prior to 2006, the story about electric vehicles was focused on air quality. What can we do to improve smog? And as much as we'd like to think that air quality has been a compelling motivation to shift an automobile industry that has been dependent upon one technology for over 100 years, it has not been the most effective story to share to shift that industry. But the policy window shifted during that time. We had oil supply disruptions from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For the first time, gas prices hit $4 a gallon. The demand for SUVs plummeted to a 16-year low. Automakers were in distress. We had new leadership on climate change. An inconvenient truth had just come out. Obama just got into office. And a new story emerged on the value of electric vehicles. No longer was it about air quality, but now it was about national security, energy independence, climate change, and also the cool factor. And so there was a new network of organizations that aligned around this story, not least of which electric utilities, which now saw themselves as the primary source of energy for this new sector. We had a lot of entrepreneurial state and local governments. We have Governor Jane Inslee from the state of Washington. We have EV entrepreneurs. So yes, of course, we know Tesla, but at the time, there were many different EV entrepreneurs who were figuring out ways to put plugs on cars and to extend their range and to extend their abilities to drive efficiently. We had civil society groups emerge to talk about the benefits of EVs, and the industry incumbents towards the end of this time then also got back in the game. And so what are the actions? What did this network do? We saw at the federal level, there was the Recovery Act of 2009 that offered federal tax rebates. There were also a lot of state and local tax rebates. EV entrepreneurs introduced new models to the market. We had the automakers introduce plug-in cars into their model line. Nonprofit and advocacy groups supported legislation for expanding charging infrastructure and tax credits. And the electric utilities introduced home charging. And I also just want to say that we do know that policy change is a dialectic. So sometimes there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes there's half a step forward, 2 steps back. This is the nature of change. And, you know, even with the EV policy, even we know with segregation policies, we've had monumental efforts to move us forward. And we've also had efforts that have moved us back. So that just comes with the process. And just know that, again, we are in it for the long term, that if you're interested in introducing change within your government teams and your institutions, that it's important to think about this as a marathon. So would love to invite you all to consider, what type of policy change would you like to introduce in your government institutions, and how might the SNAP framework for policy change help you be more strategic in your efforts? So I want to then round us out to part 3, which is, what does civic entrepreneurship look like for successful policy implementation across Fed, state, and local governments? And my research focus most recently has been looking at how have civic entrepreneurs implemented the historic policy agenda so far. What are the things that have been put in place to evolve how governments at all levels deliver for their communities? And I want to share with you a case study of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program during the pandemic. And we know that at the end of 2020, nearly a fifth of renting households reported being behind on rent, and 1 in 6 reported that eviction was very likely within a couple months. And this has a lot of implications for families that are impacted. It's not just about being without a home. It interrupts school and work. It undermines physical and mental health. New housing is harder to access when you don't have any housing at all. Of course, there's oftentimes a loss of possessions and also food insecurity. So there are myriad impacts for families. And also we know that for those of us that are working within government, it's far more challenging to be able to provide and assist a family without a home than it is when they have a home. So thinking about ways where we can keep those families that are in a precarious position in their homes, helping them stay in their homes, is often far more efficient financially, as well as preventing all of the other things that you see here. So the other thing to consider is that rent burden families existed before the pandemic. This has been a challenge that has been longstanding. We know that 1 in 4 households living under the poverty line spent more than 70% of their income on housing. And we also know that between 2000 and 2016, Americans faced 3.6 million evictions each year, 7 evictions filed every minute in 2016. Yet eviction prevention programs were relatively rare before the pandemic. So the pandemic intensified this crisis. By December 2020, nearly 9 million households were behind on their rent. We also know that Smaller landlords were disproportionately affected by the loss of rental income. And yes, there was an eviction moratorium, but it was a temporary stopgap. It didn't actually help with back payments, didn't actually help those smaller landlords with rental income. So amidst that context, Congress authorized the first emergency rental assistance program for the nation. And we have two rounds of it, one in December 2020 and another one in March 2021. And the thing to keep in mind here is that there was no pre-existing list of households in need of emergency rental assistance. And so if you put yourselves in the shoes of the folks at the Treasury, how were you going to administer these funds to the households that are most at risk of eviction? And how can you do it in the fastest way possible? And how do you make sure it's delivered in the most equitable way possible? And I share here in this graphic a couple ways to think about how do you administer funds? Do you administer funds from an equality perspective, where the example here would be every county receives an equal amount of rental assistance funds? Or do you think about it from an equity perspective, that the counties with renter households that have higher rates of cost burden receive proportionally more funds than other counties? And so the entrepreneurial opportunity here is to think about, how do we rapidly set up this infrastructure? So Treasury had to rapidly work with 400 state and local emergency rental assistance program grantees to build this infrastructure to support the potential millions of vulnerable renters, and to do it in the most equitable way possible, to make sure that those households that needed this funding were the ones that were able to receive it when they needed it. And so at the federal level, I wanted to introduce some of the things that they did to implement change in an agile way. So rapid communication was of the essence. The Treasury set up rapid comms with their grantees to explain program guidance, offer technical assistance. We had the first ever White House Eviction Prevention Summit, bringing together all the stakeholders that had input and guidance on how to continuously improve the delivery of this program. Treasury also set up what they called promising practices. So if they learned about certain counties or communities that were being more successful in reaching those households, they invited those counties, those communities to share what's working and rapidly distribute that information to the other grantees. At the state and local level, the county governments, for example, were able to, well, not everyone, but there were many examples of county governments that developed easy and accessible ways to apply. And again, there was rapid knowledge sharing. If there was one county that figured out how to do this well, other counties were able to kind of tap into that knowledge so that way they can scale their efforts. Lots of webinars, lots of events, low-tech efforts, even like this sign that you see here. I remember seeing signs at the grocery store, just photocopy signs at the grocery store. Are you in need of rental assistance? Let us know. Reach out to your local nonprofit. The nonprofits in particular were hugely instrumental because they already had relationships with communities on the ground. And so in terms of understanding who needed what when, nonprofits were hugely valuable. And then there was a lot of learning from on the ground challenges. So we learned that people needed to actually use some of those funds to do security deposits or maybe even make utility payments. And so there was this agile way of thinking, how can we strengthen this program by authorizing the use of emergency rental assistance for these other pathways as well? So this program has been recently evaluated by the Office of Evaluation Sciences. And what they found is that this program was by and large a success. Among eligible renters, the ERA funds were much more likely to reach those with the lowest incomes. They made up 64% of the recipient population. African Americans were the households that were most in need of those rental assistance, and particularly female-headed African-American families. And they were overrepresented in the sample, which means that we were able to reach the households that were most in need. And nationwide, it's estimated that 1.36 million eviction cases were prevented. So as we think about those civic entrepreneurship principles, creatively resourcing initiatives, finding who are the groups that already have relationships with these families, demonstrating grit. There were, as we all know, so many different government and nonprofit civil society teams were working around the clock to make sure that families were able to get the support they needed. Inspirational stories of what's working and how can we scale what's working, cultivating that collective intelligence. Even when things were, if there was a county that was struggling, there, by and large, there wasn't, we heard in the media, of course, a lot of finger pointing, but at least from those that are on the implementation side, there was a lot of effort and support for those governments, local, state, federal, that were interested in learning how to do things better. There was the support and there was the level of motivation and engagement to ensure that we were learning from each other. A lot of bridges across organizations that weren't normally in cooperation and collaboration with each other. On the science side, focus on public good outcomes, keep families in their homes. Having a wide lens towards policy. Yes, of course, we had this funding that was designed in this particular way, but there was also a need to consider how the funding might be expanded to cover things like security deposits. Thinking about entrepreneurship across the policy cycle, even thinking about not just in the inception of the policy, but also even thinking about the evaluation of the policy. There was a lot that was done by the Office of Evaluation Sciences from the very beginning to work with the Treasury Department to ensure that they had the right data that they needed in order to know whether, in fact, this was having the benefits that it was intended. Implementing change in an agile way, as I mentioned, and thinking about the policy window here. Before this emergency rental assistance program, the policy window for eviction assistance was closed, even though the need was great. However, as a result, we now have seen, I'm just going to share this one, that we have laid the foundation for hundreds of jurisdictions to now have developed or strengthened their eviction diversion programs. 60 cities have used their federal funds to expand access to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And since January 2021, 31 states and 81 localities have passed or implemented more than 180 tenant protections. So wanted to just share that as an example, as a source of inspiration for you all, and also an opportunity for you to consider in your own work. How has these last few years, in terms of this historic policy agenda, how has that facilitated more entrepreneurial actions in your government team? How has this built the capacity for us to better deliver for the American people? And so with that, I'm going to turn it on over to Hannah. If there are folks that have questions, or if you'd like to share what was most valuable for you today from this presentation, would love to hear. And I will pause and stop sharing my screen and pass it on over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Let me just stop recording as promised.